Broadcasting from the Hip Hop Weekly studios, I'd like to welcome you to another episode of Civic Cypher, where our mission is to foster allyship, empathy, and understanding. I am your host, Ramses Ja. Big shout out to Q Ward, who is taking care of mom after surgery, but have no fear, he will be back soon. But in the meantime, in between time, we have a very special guest, the return of a very special guest, the one, the only, Dr. Christopher Towler. For those that don't remember or were unable to bear witness to his greatness on this show, he is the associate professor in the Department of Political Science at California State University, Sacramento. He is also the director of the Black Voter Project, the co-founder of Black Insights Research, and the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Race, Ethnicity, and Politics. And today, we are going to be talking to him about a recent article entitled "From Decline to Revival: Why Democrats Must Repair Their Relationship with Black Voters." A potent article, something that a lot of people need to be made aware of, certainly in Democratic circles, but I think the population at large needs to understand the trends that you tend to track. And we're grateful for your time one more time on the show, so welcome back.
Thank you so much. Happy to be back. Excited for this conversation. Absolutely.
And again, like I said, just a lot of conversations back and forth in political circles and around the kitchen table conversations around the country. A lot of people still don't know what the what is and how to make heads or tails of the 2024 election, the implications of the 2024 election, the Democrats' strategy prior to the election and post-election. And I think that today's conversation is going to give a lot of folks a lot of valuable insight into sort of the trends that you've been monitoring. So we do appreciate your time. Before we get to all that, though, it is time, as always, to start off with some Ebony Excellence. In today's Ebony Excellence, we are going to be sharing a bit from the BIN. So this story is going viral. A black TikToker going viral himself for serving poetic justice to a white man who launched a racist tirade against him during a live stream. Tamo, who boasts over 111,000 followers on TikTok, was talking about Pokemon cards and video games when the man crashed his live stream and began repeating racial slurs. Following the incident, Tamo revealed that he had identified the man and discovered his military affiliation. And we are going to hear from him. This is at Noritamo in his own words.
To the white guy that called me slurs over and over again in my live stream the other night for no reason, guess what? You're gonna get kicked out of the United States Navy. You know how they tell us that we should be careful what we do on social media because there could be real life consequences? Hi, my name's Real Life Consequence. I've done a thorough background check and now I know everything about you. I know what little town in Texas you're from. I know your name, your phone number, your email address. I've seen your disciplinary records. I know the names of all of your family members, including your dead mother and your daughter who turns 2 next week, and her mother who's gonna have to pay for all the birthday presents this year because you came into my live stream and saw a black man who was talking about Pokemon cards and video games, and you assumed, yeah, he's not going to do anything if I call him slurs repeatedly, even though he's trying to help me. Turns out I am going to do something. Turns out there are so many things I can do because I have all the screenshots. I have all of the recordings. I know that after you left my live stream, you went into someone else's and started talking about how much you love Jesus and God and the Bible. So maybe I should send that evidence to the church you go to in that little town we both know about. I know exactly which boat in the Navy you serve on, and I know the names of black sailors that serve on the same boat as you. Maybe I'll send the clips to them as well. But only after I send them to the Naval Inspector General's office, because I'm getting you fired. I'm getting you kicked out of the Navy. There's nothing you can do to stop me. There is no apology I will accept. There is no excuse I will listen to. There is no money you could offer me. You're getting fired. And when you're working the graveyard shift in an Amazon warehouse and your back hurts and your feet hurt and those white bright lights are beating down on you, and the teenager who still has his life ahead of him walks up to you and says, "What are you doing here?" Tell him the truth. Tell him about me.
Masterful. All right. Time to get to the forthcoming conversation. So, in short, Dr. Towler, talk to our listeners a bit about, I guess a little bit about the work you do for folks that aren't familiar with you. We gave you a brief introduction, but just so people understand who we're listening to today and what qualifies you to have the conversation we're about to have.
Okay. Absolutely. I've been studying Black politics for over a decade now. going back to my days in graduate school. The last 7 years now, I've ran a national public opinion survey called the Black Voter Project, specifically designed to measure Black attitudes and behaviors towards politics. And I've really just enmeshed myself in what's going on electorally the last few election cycles, as I was worried, and it came to be somewhat true, that Black voters would end up with the short end of the stick post-Obama, meaning there would be less attention paid to them, less emphasis on their needs, and less resources invested into the Black community when it comes to getting them out to vote, to engaging them and mobilizing them, getting them excited about politics and elections. And that's really what this article, this piece that came out, is about. There were a number of different sort of 2024 obituaries written in the New York Times and the Washington Post, but none of them really focused on what happened with Black voters and what took place in the election that led to Black turnout dramatically dropping from 2020, close to 2016 numbers, and falling even more dramatically from the historic turnout rates we saw in 2008 and 2012 under President Obama.
Yeah.
And so the thrust was really there to continue to investigate the election, but centering Black voters and the Black community.
Absolutely, yeah. And you mentioned the Newsweek article, the opinion piece. So talk to us, just a brief overview, because we're going to actually spend the bulk of the show talking about some of the details in the article. But again, a general overview of the article entitled "From Decline to Revival: Why Democrats Must Repair Their Relationship with Black Voters." Sort of talk to us about why you felt this was necessary, and give us a preview, I suppose, of what we're going to be talking about.
Yeah, the article came from a place of trying to understand why Democrats did not successfully turn out Black voters at similar rates in 2024 as they did to 2020. Recent analyses suggest that Black turnout dropped as much as 6 percentage points nationally, even as much as 2 to 3 percentage points in some of the most contested battleground states. And in other states, such as Georgia, right, Black voters were the only group to experience a decline in turnout, where we saw turnout amongst white voters, Latino voters, Asian American voters all increase from 2020 to 2024. So there was something missing, some part of this story that needed to be investigated when trying to understand what happened and really understand, okay, if Black voters were turned out, what could have been, right? And part of the analysis is suggesting if Black turnout had not dropped as significantly as it did, Harris's chances in some of these battleground states, places like Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, right, would have been different. And she could have even turned or flipped some of these states blue if Black voters were poured into the way that we feel they need to be.
Yeah. So this is a part of the conversation that we've been having since the election. What happened to, there was low voter turnout across the board, but with respect to Black voters, I guess a group that we would have imagined would have shown up to support Kamala Harris. In my recollection, Kamala Harris had a plan for Black men, Black business ownership. She had pieces of legislation that were intended to address issues in the Black community. But there was still low voter turnout. Do you think that's because of misinformation or disinformation from the opposing campaign? Or do you think that's because Kamala Harris, her messaging and her plans for Black America failed to resonate? Or is it something that we haven't considered yet?
Try not to play the fence here. I think it's a combination of both, right?
Okay.
And I think the plan on the Republican side was to flood the zone with as much misinformation or disinformation as possible to try and make both parties seem sort of comparable, and to not give what we consider low propensity or infrequent voters any additional motivation to get out there and vote if they feel like, okay, Republicans and Democrats are just as bad on a lot of issues, right? We can't really differentiate the two. And so there was some success there especially on social media and with commercials, right, in certain states and in zones, really driving this narrative that Democrats and Republicans are just the same, or trying to convince voters that Republicans are better than Democrats. Again, not necessarily believing that Black voters are going to go out and vote Republican now, but that it's just going to be that much more confusing and difficult to decide if it's worth voting at all. So that's, yes, on the one hand, that's the case. On the other hand, as was kind of spelled out in the Newsweek piece, there was a problem when it came to campaign contact for the Harris campaign, in that a lot of the messaging and the information about her policies, such as you mentioned, her plan for Black men or her Black economic empowerment zone, went out to high propensity voters or voters who were going to vote anyway, right? And were likely going to vote for Democrats and for Harris. They are the ones who are getting most of this information. And understanding that Harris did have a short runway, but we really didn't see any emphasis on Black voters until October, right? Until like a month or less than prior to the election. And even going back to when Biden was the candidate, right? There could have been and should have been an emphasis on getting that information about Black voters, about their plan for Black voters, not just out there, but out there to the people in communities who are not necessarily going to vote right away, right? Who might need a little bit more convincing or might need a bit more information to make that decision to get up off their couch and vote. And so again, it kind of goes both ways, right? The misinformation helped keep people home, and the lack of information reaching the target audiences that really need it to make that decision to vote, right, from our analysis, just wasn't there or wasn't there in time.
Yeah. You know, your words ring truer than you may know, certainly around here, because Q and I, we ended up kind of working with, you know, the Harris campaign, in short. We thought that a lot of what they were trying to get out was important to share with our communities, and, you know, where we are in the space that we hold, we have the capacity to share some direct messaging from that campaign with voters across the aisle. And you're not wrong when you say that there was a late push to address specifically the needs of Black voters, and that only happened once I think Republicans and Donald Trump specifically started touting the fact that they were polling at historic highs. I don't know if they were indeed historic highs, but something like that. Effectually, this is what they were saying with respect to Black men specifically. And that caused the alarm bells to start going off within the Harris campaign. And I think that I don't know that speaks directly to Kamala Harris. I don't want to badmouth her. 107 days, as she puts it, is not a long time. And certainly you're scrambling to put together plans that affect the entire United States of America. Typically, you kind of know in advance that you're going to, you know, step into that role. But Democrats in general, I think that sort of too little too late with respect to Black voters and Black men in particular, I think it shows almost like Black voters are taken for granted, that there's a ready assumption that Black people are going to vote for Democrats or the Democratic candidate, or for a Kamala Harris, who is a Black woman. And there's no messaging or nothing that Democrats really need to do about this. And the Trump campaign, to its credit, kind of saw that, I guess, do nothing approach with respect to Black voters. This is just me guessing. And that, coupled with the sort of do nothing Democrats narrative that Donald Trump had been chronicling for a long time, which is, to be fair, partly based in reality, at least, I guess it left some folks vulnerable to the messaging coming from Donald Trump's campaign. So here's my question. You know, you mentioned from your article, Black turnout was down by 6% nationally. That's a big deal. And 2% in swing states. That's critical, because those swing states often, they kind of hinge on the margins. And this is all relative to the numbers in 2020. all things equal, Harris would have likely beat Trump in 2024 had black turnout simply matched what Biden produced. This is from your article. So what, I guess, in your words, have Democrats failed to recognize with respect to black voters? And I think the better question is, how do you believe Democrats can regain the trust of the black electorate?
Yeah, those are great points. I think, two things. First off, when talking with black voters before and after the election, this idea that Democrats don't really do anything for the black community, this do nothing Democrat narrative is there, it's present, right? And it's not just with black men, it's with black women. When we polled black women after the election, 51% of black women basically said they're exhausted after the election.
Sure.
And they kind of just want to be left alone, right? And
That's
so
fair.
this apathy is there across the board. And so and there were a number of other pieces. There was one in particular, a longer opinion piece that talked to black Republicans after the election. And many of them said the reason they look towards the Republican Party is because the Democrats don't do anything, right? And we've heard this from voters time and time again. They only show up every 4 years when they need our vote. We don't see them any other time. So this is absolutely something that the Democrats need to combat and address in the black community, this idea that they're do-nothing Democrats when it comes to black folk. And that coupled with this idea that they don't reach out to them other than elections. And when they do reach out to them at the elections, it's at the last minute, right? At the 11th hour. And so when looking at Trump and his campaign, one thing he's successfully done when he's won the White House the last two times is turn out low propensity white voters. He's found a way to invigorate and engage white people across the country who usually might not vote. They're like, oh, we're going to vote for Trump. That's something that we feel really powerful about, and we need to get out there and do that. And that's what Democrats need to figure out how to do with black voters, especially in these tight elections when they're running candidates and switching candidates and have these crazy election cycles. They need to make sure they're getting every possible black voter out to the polls that they can. And that just didn't happen this last election cycle. And so for us, right, the two main things we point out in the article, one is about contact and making sure that there are resources front loaded to either send to grassroots campaigns or to state campaigns or to state parties to get out low propensity, unlikely black voters across the battlefield. And that needs to happen early and often, right? You can't convince someone to vote who usually doesn't vote 2 weeks before the election. It's just not going to happen. You have to be getting in the communities, talking with them, sending them, mailers, flyers about your campaign, and making an impression upon them for weeks, if not months before the election in order to get them out to vote. And secondly, the messaging, right, needs to be very direct. First, meeting black voters where they are with an understanding that there might not be a really positive view of the Democrats right now in the black community. And that's not something that you can try and change on the spot. You're not going to necessarily convince someone, especially someone who's not really into politics or voting all the time, in one conversation that Democrats are there and going to change your lives. So you have to understand that you first have to meet black voters where they are. And then second, play on the environment of the time, which is this crazy Trump environment, this idea that the black community is going to be worse off tomorrow than it was today if we continue to allow Trump and the MAGA Republicans to stay in power and gain more power. And that in of itself should be enough to get people out to vote. Then once you have people voting and Democrats can regain some political power, right, the task is on them to give back to the black community, to pass policy and pour resources into the black community that they can then point to in the future, right? And kind of hope to rebuild that relationship and re-engage black voters by first understanding there's a problem, talking to them about how despite the problem, we are living in very dangerous times, that there is a major threat to the black community. And from there on forward, you can have a more sort of leveled conversation about what Democrats can do for the black community once that trust is rebuilt.
So I want to go with that because I've actually heard and read a lot of political minds suggest that I guess the approach of using scare tactics by themselves, which I don't know if this is what happened with the last election cycle, but I know that Democrats heavily leaned on it. Here's what happens that makes your life worse if you don't vote for us or if you don't vote, right? That wasn't entirely effective. Obviously, people need to know what the opposing campaign is up against, and I don't think anyone was trying to say that that's not an important part of the messaging. But there's a lot of great thinkers who've said that Democrats relied too heavily on what could go wrong if Donald Trump wins again. And there were people that suggested that this messaging might not resonate with people whose lives are already unbearably bleak. And they may not be susceptible to fear because they've already lived under a Trump administration and Trump gave them a check, quote unquote. I think you and I have had that conversation with Donald Trump putting his name on the stimulus checks. And he opposed the stimulus checks initially and had nothing to do with approving them. He just held them up. But in any event, the idea that Project 2025 and Trump Unhinged, Trump 2.0 didn't do enough to scare voters to the polls, right? It motivated voters who were already aware of that. But in terms of a scare tactic, it in and of itself wasn't sufficient. Do you have any thoughts about that? Do you think there's some truth there? Or do you think that that was a sound strategy? And again, that this campaign was susceptible to other forces that kind of cost it in the 11th hour?
I think what you said at the end remains true, right? That there's still issues with having a really short campaign that we can't really get away from, right? That's going to hinder the campaign and the strategy no matter what.
Yeah, it's not doing it any favors.
Over 100 days, right? That's not going anywhere. That's always going to be something there in the background that we have to acknowledge. That said, there is some truth in what you said that, there's a lot of analysts that are worried about Trump fatigue and, people getting inundated with too much Trump this, Trump that, and that it's going to, actually exhaust and discourage people. And we did see some of that in our data after the election, but we're not necessarily talking about trying to engage and mobilize the Black people who are paying attention to the news, who are hearing the Trump stuff day in and day out. Those are the people who are going to vote, right? Even if they say, I'm tired of hearing about Trump, they understand the importance of their vote and they understand the importance of their voice in politics. Our analysis is really focused on those Black voters who don't pay attention to politics, who might hear about Trump once or twice on the radio on their way to work, but that's it, right? They're not going to go home and turn on MSNBC and just zone out to the panel harping on Trump, for hours and hours and hours. They don't really care to do that. They're not interested in it in that way. And so we're saying, one, the campaign needs to figure out how to first contact those individuals, right, who aren't getting this political information regularly. And when they do contact them, our analysis shows that the best message to contact them is one that shows the dangers that Trump presents, right? And I hesitate to say scare tactics because our analysis is not necessarily trying to scare people, but it's trying to impression upon people that their community and their lives will be damaged further by Trump's policies in such a way that we hope angers them, if nothing else, right? That makes them understand, okay, I'm not happy with what's going on, and I'm going to be even less happy if we continue to allow these policies in this Trump presidency and MAGA to gain more power. And so that's really where it's at, where they're not going to get a lot of political messages from the start. Mm-hmm. And so the few messages that they do get, we hope, one, they're getting messages from Democrats. Our analysis showed that of those who got messages, only about 31% were people who had, were not frequent voters, compared to almost 70% of those people who voted all the time. And so the people who are not really voters, who need to be in these elections for Democrats to win, right? These Black people are just not getting a lot of messaging from the Harris campaign or others representing her or fighting for her. And so the first step is to get those people the messages, to get to their doors, to knock on them, to have bus campaigns in their communities so that they can see a presence and know that their voices matter and have people talking to them. And then secondly, to make sure they understand what's at stake here, especially in this current political environment where the Trump administration has time and again seemed to specifically target the Black community, right? I mean, right now we're living in a situation where there's federal forces and National Guards being, commissioned to go into black cities, right?
Sure.
DC, Baltimore, these places where it's clearly, symbolic of the administration's opposition to black leadership and black power.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Now, we're going to be a little short on time for this response, but give me about 30 seconds because I want to get back to your article. So this is from your article. Consider the following comparison between Biden's numbers in 2020 to Kamala Harris's in 2024. Biden captured 89% of the black vote, Harris just 85%. In swing states, it was even closer. Biden won 91% of the black vote to Harris's 89%. Now, that difference matters, and we would imagine that with Kamala Harris, she would have been just as strong or even stronger than Joe Biden. Now, based on what you found in the data, what would you guess appealed to, again, the relatively small group of black Americans who ended up voting for Trump that we didn't expect and didn't anticipate? Again, about 30 seconds.
Yeah, real quick. I think that finding is interesting. And I would say a lot of the appeal there is sort of either these conservative values that are traditionally associated with the Republican Party, coupled with, as you said before, misinformation and sort of false narratives about Trump working for black people or working for the black community. And so if you don't have a principled conservative who's just always going to vote Republican, moving to the party, and it's someone who's trying to do so based on what they think the benefits are, most of those benefits are false, right? It's complete misinformation. The point there, though, was that drop is very small, especially compared to the turnout, right? And when we're talking about that switch and vote share, we're actually talking about numbers that are within sort of this margin of error. There's no real, we can't say with confidence that there's any real difference there, but the turnout drop is far more egregious.